Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever felt that strange sense of déjà vu when looking at major historical events? Not just a feeling that things are repeating, but that the repetition itself holds a deeper, maybe more unsettling truth. Today, we're diving into exactly that, the surprising parallels and profound insights that emerge when we examine two defining global events of the early 21st century. I'm talking about the 9/11 attacks in 2001 and the global financial meltdown of 2008.
Right. And our deep dive is based on source material that argues these aren't just isolated incidents. Not at all. Instead, it frames them through the lens of Marx's famous dictum. History repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce.
But here's where it gets truly thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Our source suggests the order might actually be inverted, with 9/11 as the initial tragedy and then 2008 as the terrifying farce that followed.
Exactly.
This deep dive is designed to be your shortcut to being well-informed on these complex ideas. We want to cut through the noise, give you some surprising facts, maybe make you rethink how you see the world a bit.
And what's fascinating here is that the material we're exploring isn't just a historical recount. It's much more than that. It's a critical and deeply engaged analysis that challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom we hold about these events and our society as a whole.
So it's digging deeper.
Yeah, we're delving into a philosophical and sociological critique that connects the dots between economics, politics, and, well, human behavior. And this raises an important question for you, our listener. Our mission today isn't just to understand what happened in 2001 and 2008. It's really about why it matters and how these seemingly disparate crises reveal deeper, often hidden truths about the underlying structures of our society.
Okay, so let's begin with this uncanny repetition. The source provocatively links 9/11 and the 2008 financial meltdown, arguing they represent tragedy and farce in a strikingly inverted sequence. Now, when you first think about them, a terrorist attack and an economic collapse seem worlds apart, right?
They really do. One's a direct act of violence, the other an implosion of markets. Very different on the surface.
Yet, our source points to something truly striking in their aftermath. President Bush's language after both events.
Indeed. The analysis highlights that President Bush's addresses to the American public after 9/11 and then again after the financial collapse sounded eerily similar, almost like two versions of the same speech, as the source puts it.
Two versions of the same speech. Wow.
Yeah. Both times, Bush described a profound threat to the American way of life and issued a powerful call for swift, decisive action to cope with the danger. This linguistic echo suggests a deeper, almost structural similarity in how these crises were presented and responded to at the highest levels.
It makes you wonder if there's a kind of playbook for crisis response, doesn't it?
It certainly raises that question.
And this is where the concept of farce comes in, but not in the way we usually think of it, like something comical. Herbert Marcuse, a philosopher, added this crucial layer to Marx's dictum. He suggested that sometimes the repetition, the farce, can actually be more terrifying than the original tragedy.
Right. So if 9/11 was the raw, immediate, shocking tragedy, a direct assault, what does it mean for 2008 to be the farce?
Yeah, what does that imply?
Well, it implies a kind of cynical, almost self-aware repetition of crisis, where the underlying mechanisms are less about direct external threats and maybe more about internal systemic flaws. It's as if the second act isn't just a clumsy rerun, but a revealing, perhaps even manipulative continuation that serves particular interests. More insidious, maybe.
More insidious.
Yeah.
That fits the more terrifying idea.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, recognizing these patterns is really important for your understanding, for how you see crises unfold and how they're presented to us, the public. It suggests that the official narratives aren't just spontaneous reactions. They could be, well, potentially deliberate constructions that shape our perceptions and even our consent.
Shaping consent, that's key.
Yeah. The idea of farce implies a performative element, like a play where the severity might be exaggerated or strategically manipulated to push through certain agendas. The actors know their lines, but the audience is meant to believe it's all new and unfolding naturally.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit then. Let's
Yeah.
talk about Francis Fukuyama's famous end-of-history utopia. 12 years before 9/11, November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And that felt like, well, like the triumphant beginning of the happy 90s.
It really did. A huge moment.
And Fukuyama famously proposed this optimistic vision. Liberal democracy had, in principle, won. A global liberal community was just around the corner. Any remaining obstacles were seen as minor, temporary pockets of resistance that hadn't quite gotten the memo yet.
It was presented almost like the ultimate Hollywood ending for humanity, wasn't it?
Absolutely. But what's fascinating here is how the source argues that Fukuyama's utopia had to die twice. It received this double blow that shattered both its political and its economic facets.
Okay, walk us through that.
First, 9/11 symbolized the brutal end of that liberal democratic political dream. It marked the close of the optimistic Clintonite 90s, and it ushered in an era where new walls began to emerge everywhere.
New walls, you mean literally?
Yes, physically, like the separation barriers between Israel and the West Bank or around the EU or the U.S.-Mexico border, those became much more prominent. But crucially, these walls also appeared within nation-states themselves, pointing to internal divisions, societal fragmentation, like hidden fault lines suddenly becoming visible.
Okay, so that's the political dream shattered. What about the economic one?
Well, then came the second, equally devastating blow, the 2008 financial meltdown. If 9/11 chipped away at the political dream, 2008, as the source puts it, marked the definitive end of the economic utopia of global market capitalism.
Right. It fundamentally showed that the market isn't this benign, self-regulating thing that just works for everyone.
Exactly. It's prone to massive systemic collapses that affect us all deeply. The implication here is profound. Both Fukuyama's political and economic dreams, the twin pillars of that post-Cold War consensus, had to die not once, but twice, revealing the fragility of what so many believed was an unshakable order.
So this raises an important question. How do these shattered utopias reveal deeper, ongoing societal transformations? The source posits that these events weren't just external shocks to a fundamentally sound system. Is that right?
That's the argument. Rather, they exposed inherent contradictions and vulnerabilities that had been festering beneath the surface of that happy 90s dream all along.
So the new walls and the economic instability weren't anomalies.
No, they were symptomatic of a fundamental shift in how power and wealth operate globally, pointing towards a new, much more fragmented, maybe even more unstable world order.
Okay, building on that, let's try to unmask some of these new divisions and deceptions that our source material argues are inherent in contemporary capitalism. And the first observation that really jumps out is the emergence of this new global super-rich class.
Right. Not just wealthy individuals, but people creating an entirely new way of life, effectively walled off from the rest of society.
Exactly. The source details what it calls the members-only phenomenon, which has expanded to cover pretty much every aspect of their lives. We're talking private banking, invitation-only health clinics, private concerts, exclusive fashion shows, art exhibitions in their own homes.
Wow. It sounds completely separate.
It is. The paradox highlighted is that everything is private, 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 creating a life behind closed doors. And this extreme privacy is driven by what the source calls a hermeneutic problem, basically, the difficulty of truly understanding life with that much wealth. Apparently, wealthy families can't just invite people over and expect them to understand what it's like to have $300 million.
So their only contact with the wider world is,
Right.
what? Business and charity.
Pretty much. Business and various forms of philanthropy or humanitarianism, that seems to be the main interface.
And it goes further than just private events, right? The lifestyle itself.
Yes, their lifestyle is often centered in pristine nature trekking in Patagonia, swimming off private islands, very idyllic on the surface. But beneath this is a pervasive fear of external social life itself. The highest priorities for these ultra-high net worth individuals are minimizing security risks.
Risks like disease or crime.
Exactly. It's a life defined by insulation and protection, almost like living in a luxurious bubble.
And this isn't just a Western thing, is it?
No, it manifests globally in striking ways. In China, for instance, the new rich are building secluded communities modeled on idealized Western towns. Near Shanghai, there's a replica of a small English town complete with pubs and a Sainsbury's, but it's isolated from its surroundings by what the source calls an invisible cupola.
An invisible cupola. Like the people outside just don't exist in their minds.
That seems to be the mindset. And maybe the most vivid example is Sao Paulo, Brazil. It boasts 250 heliports in its central downtown area. The rich use helicopters to avoid mingling with ordinary people swarming through dangerous streets below.
Good grief. It sounds like something out of science fiction, like Blade Runner
Or The Fifth Element, yeah.
Yeah.
Where the privileged literally float above the chaos. It's a powerful visual.
So what's the core insight here? What's the source arguing?
The source argues that these enclaves of the super-rich are the true counterpole to the slums. They represent two sides of the same coin in a new, Very stark class division. It's not just rich and poor, it's like two entirely different social universes evolving side by side, but completely separate.
Which makes you wonder. For you, the listener, it's worth considering how you might unknowingly participate in or be affected by these growing divisions, maybe through the increase in privatization of public spaces or subtle stratifications in services that create these invisible barriers in your own community.
Absolutely. Now, let's shift to the astonishing paradox of the 2008 bailout, what the source provocatively labels financial socialism for the rich.
Okay, financial socialism for the rich. Let's break that down.
Well, one of the truly surprising aspects of the 2008 meltdown, as noted by the source, was how easily the idea was accepted that it was an unpredictable surprise, that it just hit the markets out of the blue.
Even though people had been warning about it.
Exactly. Despite the fact that for years leading up to it, demonstrations accompanying IMF and World Bank meetings had regularly protested how banks were creating illusions of growth with fictional money. They even predicted just such a collapse.
But that narrative got sidelined somehow.
It seems so. And here's what truly stands out in the source's analysis. This unexpected overlap of views between the left and conservative Republicans in opposing the bailout.
That is unexpected. How so?
Both sides, despite their vastly different politics, decried what they called moral hazard. The idea of protecting big speculators from their losses while ordinary people were left to pay the price. You had Republican Senator Jim Bunning, for instance, publicly attacking the Fed chairman's proposal, calling the bailout "socialism is alive and well in America" and un-American.
So both sides saw it as unfair, basically.
Yes, but the source then offers this sharp critique of the framing. It asks, well, if it is socialism, it's a peculiar form, isn't it? It's aimed at helping the rich, not the poor, those who lend, not those who borrow.
Okay, so the irony is.
The supreme irony is that socializing the banking system became acceptable only when it served to save capitalism itself. The underlying message seems to be, socialism is bad, except when it serves to stabilize capitalism.
It's like a firefighter who only puts out fires in mansions, saying, oh, we can't afford to help regular homes, but for the entire neighborhood, the mansions must be saved.
That's a good analogy. And this brings us to a re-examination of the familiar trickle-down argument.
Ah, yes, the trickle-down defense for the bailout.
The standard line was that throwing money at Wall Street would eventually trickle down to Main Street, helping ordinary workers and homeowners. But the source deconstructs this. It argues that if you want people to build homes under this logic, you don't give money directly to them. No, you give it to those who lend the cash. That, according to this logic, is presented as the only way to create genuine prosperity. Otherwise, it's just the state distributing funds at the expense of the real wealth creators.
So it flips the logic entirely.
It does. And the source goes further, challenging that populist slogan, "Save Main Street, not Wall Street."
Yeah.
It contends that this slogan is totally misleading, a pure form of ideology.
Why misleading? How?
Because, the argument goes, financial circulation, a sound financial system, is the lifeblood of our economies. It argues that what keeps Main Street going under capitalism is Wall Street. If you tear that wall down, Main Street will be flooded with panic and inflation.
So they're intrinsically linked, not separate.
That's the point. Guy Sorman, who the source identifies as a key ideologist of contemporary capitalism, is quoted saying, "There is no economic rationale for distinguishing virtual capitalism from real capitalism. Nothing real has ever been produced without first being financed." The paradox, then, is that you cannot throw out the dirty water of financial speculation while keeping the healthy baby of real economy in a capitalist order.
You can't separate them. No.
And this brings us to the hidden hand of state intervention. The source argues that strong state intervention in the economy is actually nothing new.
It's always been there.
In fact, it asserts that the 2008 meltdown itself was a direct result of such intervention. Remember the dot-com bubble bursting in 2001? That bubble was linked to issues around intellectual property, interestingly. Well, the bipartisan decision then was to ease credit to redirect growth into housing. So the meltdown was, from this perspective, the price paid for avoiding a recession years earlier.
So state intervention caused the problem it later had to solve.
That's the argument presented. And if we connect this to the broader global reality, We see political decisions deeply woven into international economic relations. The source gives a powerful example from a CNN report on Mali's cotton and cattle industry.
Okay, what happened there?
These two pillars of Mali's economy are suffering precisely because Western powers violate the free market rules they try to impose on poorer nations. The financial support the U.S. government gives its own cotton farmers, for instance, amounts to more than Mali's entire state budget. Competition is impossible.
Wow.
Similarly, Malian beef can't compete with heavily subsidized European milk and beef. The EU subsidizes every single cow with more money than the per capita GDP in Mali.
That's just staggering.
The Malian Minister for the Economy basically said, "We don't need your help or advice. Please just stick to your own rules about the free market and our troubles will basically be over." It clearly demonstrates the reality of country-first policies, highlighting that the free market isn't always so free, especially for developing nations.
So how do these arguments challenge common assumptions you might hold about how the economy works and the true role of government? It forces us to question whether what we see as free markets are actually deeply managed systems, where state intervention isn't an anomaly, but an inherent, often concealed part of the process, especially when it benefits powerful interests.
Right. And if this is the true nature of capitalism, what does that mean for how we understand power and ideology in our world today? It leads us into some really deep questions, which raises another important question. If capitalism operates with such hidden mechanisms, what about the left's ability to counter it? The source posits something quite stark, that the main victim of the ongoing crisis might not be capitalism itself, but actually the left.
The left is the main victim. How so?
Because of its perceived inability to offer a viable global alternative, it was in effect caught out. It's almost as if recent events were strategically, or at least effectively, designed to demonstrate that even amidst a shattering crisis, no real alternative to capitalism seems readily available.
So the crisis reinforced the status quo, in a way.
That's one interpretation the source explores. And to address this predicament, it provocatively suggests that today's left needs a thumbsing.
A themsing. What's that?
It's a Tibetan word from the time of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It means a struggle session for political re-education through confession and sustained self-criticism. The implication is pretty radical, that the left needs to undergo this intense process of self-assessment and purification to understand its failures and really re-strategize rather than just repeating old solutions that haven't worked.
Wow. A collective self-critique.
Exactly. And in light of this, the source invokes the philosopher Kant. Kant famously countered the conservative motto, "Don't think, obey." Not with "don't obey, think," but rather obey, but think.
Obey but think.
Yeah.
What's the relevance here?
The message for us as listeners is that when we are transfixed by events like the bailout, which the source frames as a kind of blackmail, we must resist the populist temptation to just act out our anger impotently. Instead, the suggestion is, control the fury, transform it into an icy determination to think things through in a truly radical way, and to ask what kind of a society it is that renders such blackmail possible.
So analysis over just outrage.
Precisely. Aiming for understanding over mere reaction.
That's a powerful call to action. Now let's talk about how crises are used as shock therapy to impose narratives.
Right. Traumatic interruptions like crises open up this field for discursive ideological competition, meaning basically a scramble for different narratives to explain what happened and offer a path forward.
We've seen that before, haven't we?
Absolutely. Think about Germany in the early 1930s, where Hitler successfully invoked a Jewish conspiracy to explain the Weimar Republic's crisis. Or France in 1940, where Marshal Petain's narrative of national repentance won out to explain France's defeat. The source warns that any naive leftist expectation that the current financial crisis necessarily opens up space for radical change is dangerously short-sighted.
Why? What's the more likely outcome?
Well, the immediate effect is often a rise in racist populism, further wars, and increased divisions. It's not automatically progressive.
Which brings us to Naomi Klein's concept, right? The shock doctrine.
Exactly. Her thesis, as outlined in the source, is that human rights violations and terror are often used to prepare the ground for radical free market reforms. For example, the U.S. attack on Iraq. It was sustained partly by the idea that shock and awe would traumatize the populace into accepting a free market paradise.
So trauma clears the way for economic restructuring.
That's the idea. The imposition of a full market economy is made much easier if the way is paved by some kind of trauma-natural, military, or economic. It forces people to shake off old habits, turns them into an ideological blank slate, ready to accept a new order because the old obstacles have been swept away. The source chillingly suggests the 2008 meltdown itself might be used as such a shock for further liberal therapy, pushing through market-friendly reforms that might otherwise face resistance.
And it doesn't stop there, does it? The source talks about market fundamentalists.
Yes, describing them almost like utopian totalitarians. When the recipes lead to destructive results, they don't question the recipe itself. Instead, they blame the failures on insufficient implementation, claiming there was still too much state intervention.
So the answer is always more of the same thing.
Exactly. They demand nothing less than an even more radical implementation of their doctrines. It's a cyclical blame game, where the ruling ideology's central task is to impose a narrative placing blame not on the global capitalist system as such, but on secondary and contingent deviations, like lax regulations or corruption.
Which prevents a deeper systemic critique.
Precisely. And the unthinkable is thereby made thinkable. A potent example given is the General Motors bankruptcy debate. Once considered impossible, the economic meltdown provided the additional nudge to normalize the prospect of GM bankruptcy. A New York Times column explicitly referred to it, looking a lot more, well, thinkable.
And what was the underlying aim there, according to the source?
The underlying aim, as the source points out, was potentially to allow GM to unilaterally reject its collective bargaining with unions. It highlights how crises are utilized to push through measures that would otherwise be politically unacceptable, reframing them as necessary for survival.
This really raises an important question for you, the listener.
Yeah.
How aware are you of the subtle ideological narratives shaping your perceptions of current events? Are you seeing objective reporting, or are they carefully constructed frames designed to guide your consent? It's worth thinking about.
Definitely. Now, let's delve into another profound ideological deception. The human, all-too-human paradox.
Okay, what's this about?
The contemporary era constantly proclaims itself post-ideological, right? As if we've moved beyond grand narratives and just deal with facts. But the source argues this very denial of ideology provides the ultimate proof that we are more than ever embedded in it.
How so?
Today, we only imagine that we do not really believe in our ideology. Despite this imaginary distance, we continue to practice it. We believe much more than we imagine.
That's counterintuitive.
It is. And what's fascinating here is the contemporary obsession with toxic people. The source references authors like Lillian Glass and Albert J. Bernstein who identify emotional vampires and offer techniques to handle them.
Right, that's a whole genre now.
It is. But then the source does this kind of profound philosophical generalization. It suggests that the very idea of a parent is toxic in that some libidinal dirt will always stain the ideal parental figure. And ultimately, it pushes this generalization to its extreme. The neighbor, as such, is toxic in its abyss of otherness.
Whoa! So the problem isn't just specific individuals, but something fundamental about human interaction.
That seems to be the implication. The deep-seated, sometimes unsettling complexities of encountering another person.
And this leads us to the core humanization paradox.
Exactly. The ideological strategy of presenting perpetrators, whether Nazi executioners or Israeli soldiers, as human, all too human, it focuses on their inner lives, feelings, imperfections. But this often serves to obfuscate or neutralize their horrific actions and responsibilities.
Can you give an example?
The source cites Jonathan Littell's novel, The Kindly Ones, a fictional first-person account of the Holocaust from an SS officer's perspective. The problem, as the source points out, isn't how to demonize, but how to portray such a figure without engendering sympathy or justification. It asks, can one imagine inviting a brutal Nazi thug to tell his story and then affirming Hitler was an enemy only because his story hadn't been heard? The danger is blurring understanding with excusing.
That's a really fine line.
It is. The source references Reinhard Heydrich, architect of the Holocaust, who enjoyed playing Beethoven's late string quartets. This richness of inner life, the source argues, is fundamentally fake. It's a screen, a false distance obscuring the true social symbolic identity. The difficult lesson from Littell's book, it suggests, is that we meet someone whose story we fully hear, but who should nonetheless remain our enemy. What's truly unbearable about Nazi executioners is not their terrifying acts, but how human, all too human they remained while doing those things.
So the humanity makes it worse, in a way.
It makes it harder to grasp ethically. The writer Elfriede Jelinek's advice is quoted. Characters should be flat like clothes in a fashion show because psychological realism is repulsive, allowing escape into the luxuriousness of personality, making ethical judgment story-blind. It warns against focusing so much on personal details that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
And this humanization tactic is seen elsewhere, too.
Yes, it's observed in the self-presentation of the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF. Israeli media, the source notes, love to dwell on the imperfections and traumas of soldiers, presenting them as ordinary people making mistakes. An example given is an IDF demolition of a suspected terrorist's home performed with accentuated kindness, helping the family move furniture first.
That sounds deeply strange.
Or another, an Israeli soldier showing a Palestinian mother a photo of his daughter who shared the same name as the Palestinian girl. The source critiques this as a gesture of empathy that neutralizes the impact of the soldier's actual activity. It's a way of saying, we're all human, despite what I'm doing to you, softening the impact.
And this shows up in films, too.
Apparently so. Claude Hilansman Sahal focuses on Israeli soldiers' experience of emergency, showing their frailty, panic, fear. Even North Korean propaganda for Kim Jong-il's golf game, conceding one two-strike game, serves to make his superhuman feat seem more realistic by appearing human. Similarly, the Baader-Meinhof complex presents Ulrich Meinhof as human, full of fears, contrasting her with the supposedly inhuman perfection of others. This humanization allows an escape into personality, obscuring the ethical dimension and making it harder to judge the underlying ideas or system.
Which brings us to, well, a crucial and somewhat disturbing contemporary figure, Silvio Berlusconi.
Berlusconi. The source presents him as the clown of a world order. A crucial figure because he uniquely combines a permissive liberal approach with fundamentalist populism.
How does he do that?
He acts shamelessly, systematically undermining the basic dignity associated with being a head of state, yet he remained unbeatable for a long time. His appeal, the source argues, lies in embodying the mythical image of the average Italian, a little bit corrupt, in trouble with the law.
So he connects by being flawed.
In a way, yes. But what's crucial to understand is that beneath this clownish mask, there is a mastery of state power functioning with ruthless efficiency. His laughter, the source suggests, is like the obscene, crazy laughter of the superhero's enemy from a Batman or Spider-Man movie.
That's quite an image.
And his rule relies on a two-headed beast, fear of immigrants and the omnipresent communists, his generic term for anyone who attacks him. This combination of technocratic administration, clownish facade, and mobilized fear highlights a very cynical form of governance where chaos and control go hand in hand.
In this cynical acceptance, it's pervasive.
The source argues it is. It uses the anecdote of Niels Bohr, the physicist, and the horseshoe above his door. When asked if he believed in it, Bohr supposedly snapped back, "I don't believe in it either. I have it there because I was told that it works, even when one doesn't believe in it."
Okay, how does that relate?
This, the source argues, is precisely how ideology functions today. Nobody takes democracy or justice seriously. We are all aware of their corrupted nature, but we participate in them because we assume that they work, even if we do not believe in them. This is why Berlusconi is called our own big kung fu panda. We act as if we're free while silently accepting invisible injunctions about what to do and think.
So this raises an important question for you, the listener. How might you unknowingly participate in or fall prey to these forms of humanization or cynical acceptance? Do you maybe silently go along with practices you don't fully believe in simply because they work without questioning the system?
And exploring this leads us to how these ideological mechanisms connect to the evolving nature of capitalism itself.
Okay, let's shift gears now and explore this new spirit of capitalism. There's a concept from sociologists Boltanski and Chiapello, right?
Yes, exactly. They distinguish three successive spirits of capitalism. The first was the entrepreneurial spirit, up until the 1930s. The second, from the 30s onwards, idealized the salaried director of the large corporation, think corporate managerial capitalism.
And the third spirit, the new one.
The truly significant shift, as the source explains, came from the 1970s onwards with this new spirit. Capitalism began to abandon the rigid, hierarchical factory-style structure. In its place, it developed more network-based forms of organization, emphasizing employee initiative and autonomy.
So less hierarchy, more networks.
Right. Work organized in teams or projects, mobilization focused on customer satisfaction. And in this way, capitalism was transformed and legitimized as an egalitarian project, accentuating self-organization, interaction. It even usurped the far left's rhetoric of workers' self-management, turning it from an anti-capitalist slogan into a capitalist one, claiming it delivered freedom and autonomy.
Wow, so it co-opted the critique.
That's the argument. And this post-68 spirit of capitalism, as the source calls it, this economic, social, cultural unity, is precisely what gave rise to the concept of postmodernism. While postmodernism was critiqued as ideology, the source acknowledges that Jean-François Lyotard, in The Postmodern Condition, authentically named a new historical epoch. Postmodernism effectively functioned as a new master signifier, a master key, helping people make sense of the dizzying changes. It became the dominant way to understand reality.
And this new spirit is linked to cultural capitalism, commodifying ethics.
Deeply intertwined, capitalism integrated the 1968 critique of alienated consumption not by dismantling it, but by commodifying authentic experience itself. A prime example is that Starbucks ad campaign. It's not just what you're buying, it's what you're buying into.
I remember that.
The ad celebrates the coffee, sure, but quickly moves to the coffee ethic. Starbucks claiming to buy fair trade, ensuring fair prices, investing in communities. The higher price, it implies, isn't just for coffee. It includes comfy chairs, good music, the right atmosphere. You're buying a feeling, a moral stance, a community, a sense of doing good.
You're buying the ethics along with the latte.
Pretty much. And this commodification extends to products like Ethos Water. Starbucks describes its program. Ethos contributes 5 cents per bottle to clean water initiatives. What's subtly not mentioned, as the source points out, is that a bottle of Ethos Water is often 5 cents more expensive at Starbucks.
Ah. So you're paying for the charity yourself through the premium price.
Effectively, yes.
All right.
You're buying your sense of ethical participation. Other examples abound. Hilton Hotels claiming travel should make us a better person. Or organic food, why do we buy it, even if it's maybe not much healthier? The point, the source argues, is that we are not merely buying and consuming, we are simultaneously doing something meaningful, participating in a collective project.
But there's an irony here, isn't there?
The huge irony. In our era of spiritualized hedonism, where happiness is the direct goal, the number of people suffering anxiety and depression is exploding. It's this enigma of self-sabotaging happiness that makes Freud's message, the source suggests, more pertinent than ever. Our pursuit of pleasure often leads to dissatisfaction.
This embrace of happiness is even, like, official policy in some places. Bhutan?
Yes, Bhutan decided to measure gross national happiness, GNH, instead of GNP. To guide modernization while preserving identity. They surveyed citizens on parameters like psychological well-being, health, education, governance, living standards, community, ecology. The source suggests this is arguably cultural imperialism, imposing a Western individualized, measurable view of happiness rather than allowing for diverse cultural interpretations.
Interesting. And how does this new spirit reframe socialism?
Well, a powerful narrative has been constructed where socialism appears conservative, hierarchical, administrative. The lesson of 68 is framed as goodbye, Mr. Socialism, with digital capitalism presented as the true revolution, the logical consequence of the 68 revolt.
So capitalism becomes the revolutionary force.
That's the narrative. Even Che Guevara, once a radical icon, became the quintessential postmodern icon, signifying everything and nothing. Youth rebellion, solidarity, saintliness. A Vatican representative praised him. He became a commodified image, Cherry Guevara ice cream even.
But the source notes this commodification is fragile.
Yes, it calls the insistence on Che as a neutral commodity desperate. Warnings about him being a cold-blooded murderer resurfaced precisely as new anti-capitalist rebellions emerged, making his icon potentially dangerous again. This suggests when a symbol gets too potent, efforts are made to neutralize it through commodification or by highlighting negative aspects.
Taking away its power.
Right. The source also connects the exhaustion of the 68 emancipatory potential to a push towards the real. When socio-political engagement faltered, the only remaining option seemed to be a direct, brutal passage à l'acte, a desperate action.
What forms did that take?
3 main forms. The search for extreme sexual indulgence, leftist political terrorism like the Red Army faction, or Red Brigades, who thought only violence could awaken the masses, and a turn towards inner experience through Oriental mysticism. What all 3 shared was a withdrawal from concrete socio-political engagement into direct contact with some raw, intense, real.
And how did the establishment respond to the 68 spirit? There's a critique by Jean-Claude Milner.
Yes, Milner critiques how the establishment successfully recuperated the spirit of 68. Demands for new rights, which would meant real power redistribution, were granted, but only as permissions. The permissive society broadens what subjects can do without actually giving them more power.
Permissions versus rights.
Okay.
Milner states these permissions, like rights to divorce, abortion, gay marriage, make life easier, which is not nothing. But they don't diminish the power of the one who gives it. It doesn't augment the power of the one who gets it. It doesn't fundamentally change the power balance.
So Milner's conclusion is quite bleak. It is. His bitter conclusion is that the spirit of '68 became the best ally of the Restoration, leaving the impoverished youth with nothing but violence on the margins. While '68 aimed for politicized activity, the spirit of '68 transposed this into depoliticized pseudo-activity new lifestyles, which became a form of social passivity. This, Milner argues, is why we see recent outbursts of violence in suburbs devoid of utopian content as frustration, not directed politics.
This raises a critical question for you, the listener.
Yeah.
How do you differentiate between genuine social change, actual power redistribution, and this commodification of ethics, or the granting of permissions? Are you experiencing permissions or true rights? It's a subtle but crucial distinction.
It really is. Now let's explore perhaps the most crucial shift. The argument that exploitation is transforming from labor to rent.
Okay, from labor to rent, what does that mean?
Marx, in his writings, actually envisioned a future where general social knowledge, collective intelligence, would become a direct force of production. Almost like humanity's shared brain becomes capital itself. This suggests a radical transformation where exploiting individual physical labor, traditionally understood, would be undermined.
And how does that play out today? Negri's view.
The philosopher Negri argues that in today's global interactive media, creative inventiveness is collectivized. It's part of the common shared resources and knowledge. Therefore, any attempt to privatize it through copyright becomes problematic. More literally, property is theft when it comes to intellectual property.
Which leads to the paradox of companies like Microsoft.
Exactly. Companies like Microsoft exploit this collective synergy of creative cognitive contributions through copywriting. The traditional Marxist idea of commodity fetishism, where relations between people look like relations between things, needs rethinking. In immaterial labor, like software or media, relations between people aren't hidden. They are the very material of our everyday exploitation.
So this brings us to the core idea. Post-industrial capitalism is characterized by the becoming rent of the profit.
Right. When wealth is earned out of all proportion to the direct labor time spent, profit transforms into rent. Rent appropriated by privatizing this general intellect or shared knowledge.
And what's the implication of that shift?
What's fascinating is the implication. This shift necessitates direct authority and state intervention to impose the arbitrary legal conditions for extracting rent. These conditions are no longer spontaneously generated by the market. You need a strong state to enforce intellectual property laws, for instance, which create the conditions for this kind of rent.
Can you give an example, like oil?
Oil is a good one. Marx used oil as an example of an ordinary commodity priced by production cost. But today, its price is largely a rent due to scarcity and limited supply, not just production costs. This shows how even natural resources become sites for rent extraction, requiring state power to maintain control over access and distribution. The source suggests intellectual planning, material production, and resource provision are increasingly separated into autonomous spheres, creating new ways to accumulate wealth.
And how does this show up socially? In class division?
Yes, in its social consequences, this separation appears in a new class division within developed societies. Not classes in the old sense, but three fractions of the working class. First, intellectual laborers with their enlightened hedonism, liberal multiculturalism. Second, the old manual working class, often characterized by populist fundamentalism. And third, the outcasts, the unemployed, slum dwellers, those in public space interstices, often forming extreme semi-illegal groupings like gangs or sects.
So the working class itself is fragmented.
Deeply divided into these three parts, each played off against the others. Intellectual laborers full of cultural prejudices against redneck workers, workers with populist hatred of intellectuals and outcasts, outcasts antagonistic to society as a whole. What they all share, the source notes, is using a particular identity as a substitute for a missing universal public space. This prevents a unified front against exploitation.
It makes it harder for these groups to find common cause.
Much harder.
So how do these new forms of exploitation and class division impact your work, your access to resources, your social identity? Are you seeing these divides in your own communities, maybe without recognizing their underlying causes, seeing them as cultural differences rather than economic ones?
Okay, let's turn now to the fundamental antagonisms embedded within global capitalism. The source argues these are strong enough to prevent its indefinite reproduction. There are four such antagonisms, or deep contradictions, constantly pushing against the system. First, the looming threat of ecological catastrophe.
Climate crisis, basically, which Nicholas Stern called the greatest market failure in human history.
Exactly. Second, there's the inappropriateness of private property in relation to intellectual property. Things like language, communication, education, collective creativity, increasingly treated as private commodities despite being shared resources. What the source calls cognitive capital.
Right. Privatizing the commons of the mind.
Third, we have the socio-ethical implications of new technoscientific developments, especially in biogenetics. These raise the unsettling prospect of actually changing human nature itself.
Okay, ecology, intellectual property, biogenetics. What's the fourth?
The source describes how the first three antagonisms designate different aspects of the commons, our shared substance, whether planet, culture, or human nature. Privatizing these commons involves violent acts. But it's the fourth antagonism that's presented as the crucial one.
And that is?
The creation of new forms of apartheid, new walls and slums, the ever-widening gap that separates the excluded from the included.
The gap between the included and the excluded. Why is that one crucial?
Because, the argument goes, without it, the other three lose their subversive edge. Ecological concerns. They might just become problems of sustainable development for the included. Intellectual property. Reduced to complex legal challenges for corporations. Biogenetics, seen merely as ethical issues for the privileged.
So those problems could potentially be managed within the system, even through authoritarian means, without challenging the core inequalities.
Precisely. While still maintaining or even strengthening existing hierarchies and exclusions. It is only this gap that separates the excluded from the included that, according to the source, justifies the use of the term communism and prevents these struggles from becoming merely private concerns of the included. The first three concern humanity's survival, yes, but the fourth is ultimately a question of justice. It shifts the focus from simply surviving to asking, survival for whom?
Which of these antagonisms feels most urgent to you? How might they be interconnected in your daily life, maybe in subtle ways you hadn't considered, showing how global issues manifest locally?
Now, for a truly provocative idea, communism, again.
Okay, that's a bold statement. Where does the source go with this?
It argues that the blatant irrationality of global capitalism was starkly shown by the 2008 bailout. The U.S. alone spent $700 billion to stabilize banks, while only a fraction of the pledged $22 billion was actually made available to help poorer nations' agriculture despite a global food crisis.
That contrast is stark.
And Bill Clinton himself admitted, we blew it on global food. By pressuring developing countries to export crops, ruining their self-sufficiency, increasing reliance on imports.
Creating vulnerability.
Exactly. And this vulnerability has led to even more systematic strategies. Major corporations and governments are now leasing vast tracts of land abroad, particularly in Africa, to secure their own food and biofuel supplies. The source points to South Korean company Daewoo Logistics negotiating a 99-year lease on nearly half of Madagascar's arable land. Yes. While Daewoo claims this brings investment and jobs, the source argues it will only exacerbate food dependency for locals who will then have to buy imported food. This raises the alarming possibility of a future global apartheid, secluded, resource-rich areas separated from chaotic, starving outside regions.
That's a terrifying prospect.
In such a scenario, the source provocatively asks, do people in Haiti, facing starvation and systemic oppression, have the full right to violent rebellion? It forces a confrontation with the ethics of global inequality.
It certainly does. This grim outlook brings us to Lenin, surprisingly, an essay about climbing a mountain.
Yes, Lenin's fascinating essay on ascending a high mountain. He uses the simile of a climber who has to return to the valley after a failed attempt to reach a new peak. This, for Lenin, describes making a retreat in a revolutionary process, not just slowing down, but radically beginning from the beginning over and over again.
Like that Samuel Beckett line, try again, fail better.
Exactly like that, a repetitive movement. The source applies this to our current moment. After the obscure disaster of 1989, the end of the Cold War era, we must rethink everything, beginning from the 0 point.
And this beginning from the 0 point connects to Alain Badiou's idea, the communist hypothesis.
Precisely. Badiou states, The communist hypothesis remains the right hypothesis, and I do not see any other. For Badiou, it's not a specific program, but an eternal idea that needs to be reinvented in each new historical situation.
So not a blueprint, but an ongoing question or task.
Yes, and the source explicitly challenges the utopian premise that fundamental capitalist problems like universal health care or equitable wealth redistribution can be solved gradually within the system. It argues that if these problems are structurally necessary, then incremental reforms aren't enough. A more fundamental shift is needed.
The source also says philosophers are the true realists and cynics are naive.
It does, arguing that cynics know their positions are inconsistent and that they sincerely believe in the principles they mock. It then turns the tables, asserting the true utopian epoch was that of the happy Clintonite 90s with its end-of-history belief. The experience of recent decades clearly shows the market isn't benign. It requires a good deal of extra-market violence to establish and maintain its functioning.
And the financial meltdown exposed this irrationality.
Absolutely. Badiou's observation is piercing. The ordinary citizen must understand that it is impossible to make up the shortfall in Social Security, but that it is imperative to stuff untold billions into the bank's financial hole. It's normalized that we can't nationalize a struggling factory, but it's obvious to do so for a bank made penniless by speculation. This shows the profound ideological power making the unthinkable normal when it suits the system.
Which brings us back to the left, or Western Marxism, and its deadlock. Why hasn't the working class become that revolutionary subject?
The source suggests successful socialist revolutions, like Cuba or Yugoslavia, often succeeded by co-opting the desire for national liberation or other forms of rage capital.
Right.
It wasn't just about class struggle. For example, in communist Yugoslavia, the party apparently cheated almost openly in the 1946 election, knowing they'd lose the next free one. This made it clear what kind of election they were prepared to tolerate, showing awareness of the unique opportunity that brought them to power and foresight about long-term popular support. Power often maintained beyond just consent.
Okay, shifting focus. The public use of reason. Kant again, and Obama.
Right. Kant distinguished the public use of reason, a singular individual bypassing particularities to participate in the universal, from a more private, ironic approach. Kant's paradox, think freely but obey, highlights participating in the universal as a singular individual, often detached from communal identity.
And how does Obama's election fit in?
It's interpreted as the sign of history in that Kantian sense. You can be cynical and see it as Bush with a human face, a tactical change to reassert U.S. hegemony more humanely. But the source argues there's something deeper. Like the fall of the Berlin Wall, Obama's victory disproved cynical pragmatism, showed possibility against odds, triggering universal enthusiasm because the unthinkable had happened.
But there's also a critique of Obama, the self-cleansing.
Yes, a critique of his political self-cleansing during the campaign, like the historical censorship around Martin Luther King Jr. to appeal to wider audiences. This potentially diluted his core message.
Still, the source emphasizes the power of words.
Despite the cynicism, yes. It recalls Ehud Barak saying he would have joined a terrorist organization if born Palestinian, a statement that, regardless of intent, opened a space for dialogue. Or Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, which unleashed an avalanche despite his original intentions. Words can shift ideological contours and open new spaces.
This brings us to Hegel and Haiti, a surprising connection.
Very. While Hegel shared Kant's enthusiasm for the French Revolution, the scholar Susan Buckmores argues the successful slave uprising in Haiti, leading to a free republic, was the silent and absent cause for Hegel's famous master-slave dialectic.
Wow. How so?
European Enlightenment philosophers, the source argues with acerbic brutality, railed against slavery metaphorically while ignoring its literal existence in the colonies.
The hypocrisy.
Exactly. The ex-slaves of Haiti, the source argues, took French revolutionary slogans, liberty, equality, fraternity, more literally than did the French themselves, ignoring implicit qualifications of race and maturity. When French soldiers tried to suppress them, the Black Army singing the Marseillaise made a powerful statement. In this battle, we are more French than you. We stand for the innermost consequences of your revolutionary ideology, the very consequences you were not able to assume.
That must have been deeply unsettling for the colonizers.
Profoundly. It appropriated and redefined their own egalitarian tradition, obliterating its implicit exclusions.
Which leads to post-colonialism and self-blame. Bruckner's critique.
Yes, Pascal Bruckner critiques European politically correct self-flagellation as an inverted form of clinging to one's superiority. Accepting guilt reasserts control or patronizingly deprives others of responsibility. The source then references Marx's Eurocentric articles on British rule in India. Despite describing brutality, Marx noted how colonization was an unconscious tool of history, creating conditions for India's double liberation from tradition and colonization. This is mature independence, self-liberation.
Not just being granted freedom.
Right. And Saint-Simon refused to capitalize on colonizers' guilt, focusing on humanity's broader struggle for dignity, not just past victimhood. Similarly, Sadri Chiari's critique of French leftists seeking papers for sans-papiers highlights their double invisibility. A dark external threat when undocumented, drowned in the indistinct crowd when legalized. Yet, the source notes getting papers does open political space. The true fear for oppressors isn't mythical self-definitions, but self-definitions that appropriate white egalitarian tradition and redefine it, obliterating exclusions Haiti as the defining moment.
Okay, now for another unexpected parallel. Islam and communism.
Yes, the source recalls historical millenarian communist rebellions within Islam, like the Qarmatian Republic, 899, or the Zond Revolt, 869-83. These were radically egalitarian communities, communal property, no money laws, equality for women.
And how does this connect to contemporary events? Iran, 2009.
What's fascinating is how the source connects this. The Green Movement and Musavi supporters' cries of Allah Akbar in 2009 were seen as a repetition, a return to the roots of the 1979 Khomeini Revolution's genuine utopia of political and social creativity, which was later stifled. Ahmadinejad is characterized as a corrupted Islamo-fascist populist, and Iranian Berlusconi, whose regime's wealth came from corruption, with the Revolutionary Guards as a megacorporation.
And the Israeli-Arab conflict is framed as a distraction.
As a false conflict that mystifies the true issues, diverting attention from internal power struggles.
There's also a point about the Taliban and class struggle.
Yes, citing a New York Times report on the Taliban's 2009 takeover of Swat Valley. It described how they succeeded by exploiting profound fissures between landlords and landless tenants, organizing peasants into shock troops. This highlights a clear class revolt, demonstrating Walter Benjamin's thesis. Every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution. Fascism replaces leftist revolution, proving a revolutionary potential the left failed to mobilize.
This also brings us to authoritarian capitalism.
Yeah.
Asian values.
Exactly. Capitalism with Asian values, a concept invented by Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew, adopted by Deng Xiaoping in China. This development has world historical meaning because it fundamentally breaks the traditional link between capitalism and democracy.
So capitalism doesn't need democracy.
That's the suspicion, that China's authoritarian capitalism isn't an anomaly, but a sign of the future, economically more efficient, suggesting democracy might even be an obstacle. And Mao's Cultural Revolution, with its brutal erasure of past traditions, may have inadvertently created the shock and conditions for China's capitalist explosion by dismantling old structures.
Which leads to a critique of parliamentary democracy itself. Chomsky and Lippmann.
Yes. Chomsky noted its passivizing core, suggesting only when the threat of popular participation is overcome that democratic forms can be safely contemplated. Lippmann coined manufacturing consent, positively, arguing the public is a bewildered herd needing elite governance. Our democracies, the source contends, function this way, often with our consent.
Like a constitutional monarch.
The ordinary citizen is like a king in a constitutional democracy, deciding only formally, signing off on executive measures. The crisis of democracy occurs when people stop trusting elites, recognizing the true throne is empty, and the decision is really theirs, leading to anxiety. Badiou distinguishes empirical corruption from the constituent corruption of the democratic form itself, its fundamental consensual representation of capitalism.
So elections aren't necessarily truth.
Not per se an indication of truth, the source argues, but often reflecting predominant common opinion. Pétain winning 90% in a hypothetical 1940 election illustrates this consensus born of fear, perhaps. Putin and Berlusconi are cited as examples of authoritarian capitalism in democracies reduced to empty ritualized shells with high popular support despite worsening economics.
So how should we reimagine the dictatorship of the proletariat? That sounds jarring.
The source presents it as a necessary oxymoron. Not a state where the proletariat rules in the old sense, but a radically transformed state relying on new popular participation. Lenin's state and revolution aimed not to take over state power, but to transform it, changing its functioning and relationship to its base. A state truly representing popular will, not managing it.
And this requires voluntarism, acting against the odds.
Yes. The source suggests the big other is against us. History isn't necessarily on our side. The inner thrust often leads to catastrophe. Pure voluntarism is needed to act against historical necessity. Lenin's 1921 predicament, building socialism in one country when objectively hopeless, but stimulating the efforts tenfold, opened new opportunities.
And contemporary examples, the new Kravchenkos.
People like Morales in Bolivia, former Aristide in Haiti, Maoists in Nepal elected but bypassing party-state networks, improvising in objectively hopeless situations. They're presented as new Kravchenkos. Viktor Kravchenko, the Soviet defector, denounced Stalinism but later sought a less exploitative mode for poor farmers, failed, and committed suicide in despair.
So these new figures represent hope despite the odds.
These new Kravchenkos, emerging everywhere, are ready to act against all odds to reinvent communism. They are the only hope because they have awakened from the utopian dream that holds most of us. The dream things will improve within the system. The source notes even anti-communist leftists, like Deleuze before his death, return to the communist idea seeking reconciliation, suggesting its core ideas still hold vital truth.
Which leads to Badiou's concept of subtraction. What is that?
A complex, amphibious concept with 3 layers. Withdraw, disconnect, reduce complexity to minimal difference, and destroy the existing order. The goal is to violently perturb the field from which it withdraws, laying bare its true coordinates and denaturalizing the hegemonic field, making the dominant way of thinking seem unnatural, constructed.
So communism is presented as a problem.
More than a solution. Communism is itself the name of a problem, a name for the difficult task of breaking out of the confines of the market and state framework.
And the challenge is rethinking the state itself.
Yes. The failure of communist state party politics was the failure of anti-statal politics, the failure to truly transform the state. The true task isn't withdrawal, but to make the state itself work in a non-statal mode, fundamentally changing its operation to be inclusive, participatory. The conservative, Hegel, authoritarian capitalism, strong state, is contrasted with the Hegel of Haiti, authentic, emancipatory drive, true universality, popular self-liberation.
So the final question is about breaking the cycle.
Can today's worldless capitalism, constant disruption, open space for a revolution that breaks the cycle of event return to normality? Can it instead enforce a new ordering against the global capitalist disorder? Not just reacting to chaos, but imposing a new, coherent, more just order challenging the system's foundations. #tag outro.
So where does that leave us? Wow, we've journeyed through the uncanny echoes of tragedy and farce and major global events. We've tried to unmask the shifting face of capitalism, its new divisions, confronted the illusions of humanity, the subtle politics of fear, and finally wrestled with these inherent antagonisms that capitalism itself seems to generate.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
What really stands out is how this deep dive challenges our default assumptions about progress, about stability. It reveals that what we often perceive as normal or natural might actually be the most deeply ingrained ideology of all.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source suggests something quite radical about facing catastrophe, that to adequately confront it, we must first perceive it as our fate, as unavoidable. Then, only by projecting ourselves into it, adopting its standpoint, can we retroactively insert counterfactual possibilities upon which we act today.
That's a mind-bending idea.
It really is. And it raises an important question for you, the listener. If, as the source suggests, accepting disaster as inevitable is the first step towards changing it, how does that transform your sense of agency and the actions you might take?
It makes us wonder if the true utopian dream is actually the one we are living right now.
And what it would truly take to awaken from it and maybe, just maybe, build something genuinely new.
Keep digging, keep questioning, and join us next time for another deep dive.